Welcome back to the Human Project. In this series, my aim is to present Marxism in a deeper and broader context. The idea that it's not just an economic theory that originated in the 19th century, although as an economic theory it certainly is extremely important and the only theory able to explain what's going on today. But it's much more than that. It's about not just economics, it's about people. And we can date it back all the way to the beginning of humanity altogether in what I'm calling the human project, which is from the very dawn of humanity, people had this sense that there could be and needed to be a better world, a world of harmony and peace, where everything is united and so on. And so that vision that Marx promoted so centrally has been with us from the very beginning, and it's important to know that. Okay, today is May 6th of 2025, and so it's almost a week since April 30th, when there were major demonstrations in Africa, a number of countries and cities in Africa, and in several cities in the so-called West, Paris, New York, I don't know where else, all in support of the sovereignty and viability of the country of Burkina Faso and its leader, Ibrahim Traoré. And what I saw was a level of consciousness, a level of unity in political purpose that I've never seen before. And I was very aware of the anti-colonial struggles in Africa in the 60s and 70s, particularly, the armed struggles against the Portuguese colonialism and the various other struggles, and most of whose leaders met an untimely demise. In Angola and Mozambique, the West was able to mobilize and organize powerful contra armies. But I think times are different now for two reasons. One, there's a level of consciousness and a level of people understanding that the day of colonialism is done and the people need their independence. So there's a level of feeling about that and awareness of that that I think didn't exist before. And so part of that is due to historical development itself, just that times move along and people are no longer able to put up with what they were before. And I always give the example, the French Revolution, when one day people woke up and said, what are we doing with these kings and queens? Let's chop off their heads and have our own society. Wasn't that simple, obviously, but you get the idea. It reaches a point where people just aren't willing to put up with the social structure that they had put up with. So I feel like the days of colonialism in Africa especially are over, or this is the beginning of the end, because here you have millions of young people saying, why are we allowing our natural resources to be taken away for somebody else's profit? It doesn't even make any sense. So when history reaches a point where something, that's called delegitimation, when something doesn't make any sense, then its days are numbered. Maybe that'll happen in the so-called West, where people will wake up one day and say, how come we're all struggling to pay our bills? There's more and more homeless people out on the street, and you have these gazillionaires making so much money they couldn't even begin to know what to do with it. So they've bought our whole political system, and then they still have money left over. So one day people will say, wake up and say that. But anyway, back to Africa. The Chinese speak about their century of humiliation, which went roughly from 1850 to 1950, 100 years, during which time they were under the boot of a pretty vicious colonialism, primarily the British and the Japanese, But then a few other countries, I think Germany, the United States, got into the act also. And it was vicious. The Japanese slaughtered a lot of people. The British were pretty vicious too. And so the Chinese, prior to that, they had a successful empire that was really, they were one of the top countries in the world, if not the top country. So it was 100 years of subjugation and colonial oppression. And they refer to that as the century of humiliation. Well, okay, what about Africa? I think if we look at Africa, we can say, well, at the very least, their century of subjugation began with the defeat of Egypt in 500 BC or thereabouts. So if we go from 500 BC until now, that's 2,500 years of humiliation, contrasted with 100 years for the Chinese. So we have 2,500 years at least of humiliation for the African people. That also included, of course, the vicious slave trade that went on for hundreds of years. So something new is dawning that's historically unprecedented. We have the end of a 2,500-year era. And I think it's as a Marxist, you want to know, where are we in history? What's going on? We don't just think of the present events as things that happen to be happening. We want to look at the whole cycle of history to get a sense of where are we, what's going on. And so what we're seeing is, first of all, the end to the colonial era, which began, say, 500 years ago, or however long ago. So that's the end of that cycle. But then if we date it back to Egypt, where we see the conquest of Egypt was sort of the founding of so-called Western civilization. And when I went to college, and it was a good college, the idea was that civilization began with Western civilization. That is civilization. And, with the Greeks and the Romans and all that. But now it turns out that Western civilization involved not only the repression, but kind of the denial of African civilization. And I'm going to have to devote other talk to this another time, because the more you learn about it, the more weird it is. How the whole consciousness of Western civilization seemed to necessarily involve some kind of denial of Egypt. So, of Africa, and the denial of Egypt, of course, as well. Egypt being the most developed portion of African civilization. So, and this has gone on until, say, it started in, around 500 BC, and as recently as just a few decades ago, you had scholars still denying that there was that much interesting going on in Egypt. It's like, oh, Africa, a bunch of people just running around in the jungle, not much going on there. Then it turns out, wow, really interesting stuff was happening in Egypt, and it was mostly independently working, mostly African and African-American scholars, although there was one French scholar whose name I forget. So it took until the late 20th century to establish, wow, there's really interesting stuff going on in Egypt. First of all, all the science that went into the pyramids and all the cosmology and mathematics and this, that, then all their ways of thinking, their spirituality. The more we became able to decipher their language, the more it was seen this was very sophisticated. So, okay, what was the next position? Well, okay, yeah, there was interesting stuff going on there, but it wasn't really African people. It was, Mediterranean brown-skinned people. And as recently as just a few years ago, or maybe last year, there was a whole scandal in modern-day Egypt when the African-American comedian Kevin Hart had a performance scheduled, and he made the mistake of mentioning that ancient Egypt was black, that they were African people. Well, modern Egypt had a fit, the leadership, the intellectuals, the average person on the street, no, these were not Africans. They were brown-skinned people just like us. Well, it's taken quite a bit. There was a whole conference, a UNESCO conference, where some Egyptian scholars had to make the point. I mean, they had to prove the point through all kinds of analysis, and subsequently it's been shown, analysis of the artwork, the DNA. People had to really work on showing ancient Egypt was an African people. That means black. And okay, there's a great variety of African people. Some are very dark skinned, some are lighter skinned, and so on. But it still is African people, African culture. And it's unbelievable, the struggle that went on, and that still goes on. These people in modern day Egypt, they were apoplectic at the idea that ancient Egypt was African. And it was the most blatant racism that you can imagine, coming out of the mouths of the intellectuals, the politicians, and the average people. So, okay, where am I? Okay, I'm making the point that this transition from Africa to so-called Western civilization was very odd. And I'll get into much more detail in future talks. But it involved, Greece was very dependent on Egypt. Many Greece, the philosophers and scholars, had hopped on the boat, made that trip, not very long, just a day and a half or so, over to Alexandria, Egypt, studied for years with the Egyptian teachers, came back, used that knowledge to develop their own systems. But the official policy of the academy and the government in Egypt was to deny anything that these people had even gone to Egypt. Very weird. How did they know to deny that? Then it turns out, which I just learned, that there were Egyptians coming to Greece and helping with their architecture and so on and so forth, intermarrying. That's been wiped out from history. So something very weird is going on, and with my interest in philosophy, it seems that the so-called Western philosophy involved a repression and suppression and denial of Egyptian philosophy, the African way of thought, the African mode of spirituality. And this point has been developed in great detail by Professor Marimba Ani, retired from Hunter College, who herself was a protege of John Henrik Clarke, who was a protege of Shanta Diop. Now I forgot his whole name. Anta Diop, Sheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese professor, who was really primary in making the point that Egypt had a culture and a philosophy that had certain commonalities despite the great linguistic and cultural differences among Egyptians. And I said he had to actually organize a UNESCO conference to prove that point. Okay, so maybe that's all I'm going to say right now, except that this Marimba Ani, the criticisms that she has of what she's calling Western thought, possibly unknown, I don't know if it's unknown to her, because it seems she has read some Marx and Engels, are the same criticisms that Marx, Engels, and Lenin had of what they call metaphysical thinking, or also called it mechanical materialism. So it was the same criticism. And it was very similar that with the idea that the so-called Western way of thinking is a way of rationalizing a politics of domination, of domination of humans over nature, of one group of humans over another group, and so on. And so that a way of thinking developed with so-called Western civilization that ultimately justified, colonialism and slavery and all that. So the point is, we've now reached an end of this cycle, the 500-year cycle of colonialism, the 2,500-year cycle of so-called Western civilization and the denial and repression of Africa. And according to Marxism, we're at the end of the whole cycle of class society. Not at the end, but at the beginning of the end. And it's important to know this because when we really look at what's going on and try to understand it, we have to, if we look closely, we can see these dynamics in place. And we can see how this mentality, this way of being, is reaching its final stages. And okay, I think that's enough for today.